Cheers, and welcome to Americans Learn. My name is Lauren, and today I'm going to be watching a Swordmaster rate 10 sword fights from movies and TV shows. In order to prep for this, I've got my own sword. It's here. It's ready to go. Ready to see if I know any of these moves or not. The chances are probably going to be on not on that one, but you know, I know some things, and I'm excited to see what a true master has to say. I'm sure that I will know a significant number of these fights. So, let's see, watching them now, if I know anything. Let's see what the Swordmaster has to say.
My goodness, this is terrible. There is so much bad in this. Hi there, my name's David Rolling at the London Longsword Academy. I'm a full-time swordsmanship instructor, and today I'm going to have a look at a load of clips about sword fighting and slag them off hideously.
Yeah!
So basically what I have with me here is a longsword. Longsword for me is generally a sword which is held in two hands. So it doesn't matter whether the grip is short or long, it doesn't really matter. You have a pommel, a crossguard, a grip, a blade. Usually within fencing we divide that into two halves, but different authors divide it into different divisions. So we'll have a strong half, which is the half from the middle to the hilt, and then from the middle down to the point is the weakest part. And we're just really looking at geometry and leverage. That you get this big thing in historical European martial arts, as I do, where you're not allowed to carry swords on your shoulder because that's really, really frowned upon and no one would ever do it. Except there's actually critique in manuals saying that you shouldn't do it, which implies that people do it.
I've heard that it just doesn't work. Like, you can't, if you've got like a sword on your, especially if it's a long sword, but like it just doesn't, you can't actually pull it up correctly in order to draw.
So carrying the sword in your hand is a very, very good thing, and you see this a lot, people holding the sword on their shoulder and just walking around with it without a scabbard on necessarily, so it's ready to use. I have issues with this particular fight because there's a lot of reverse grip with the sword being held backwards down here. It's not a good way for you to use the sword. You sacrifice your ability to defend above very, very clearly. You have not got any reach. It's not safe. But he's changed grip. Yay. Oh, and he's back.
He's back.
I like how he moves. I think he's got a good organic feel to him. Generally, the sword is being moved in front of him, which is a very, very good thing. It's very rarely just kept behind him, so he's closing the space off between him and his opponent with the sword. One of the things I like about some of the Witcher's fight scenes is that there's this idea of moving between the opponents. And you see this in things like Godino, where the idea of spinning, something which people really, really quite often frown upon within the HEMA community, is very much used because you're trying to keep opponents away from each other. So it's not just about fighting you and concentrating and moving into you, it's against driving you back and then hitting the next person, the next person, the next person. So these spinning moves actually become quite important, and this angled, sinister, straight into you idea goes out the window. It's not this focus. Suddenly it's much more wide and it's a flurry. The thing is most of my judgment on this fight scene is actually Henry Cavill being very, very good physically, and what is shown in this fight scene being probably the most disappointing fight scene in The Witcher. So for Henry Cavill it's going to have like an 8. For actual quality of fighting it's going to have about 4.
We're going to rate Henry Cavill an 8, which is probably the lowest he's ever been rated ever in his life. Okay, we're doing one-handed. Glad of swords.
So there's bits in there that actually aren't too bad looking at it. There's evasions of the blade from the Emperor, which could be accidental, but you have these movements of just moving around as the parry's coming in. That's actually not too bad. You see this kind of thing quite often. You see it in Distrezza when opponents are moving around each other, where a parry comes in, you disengage underneath as it's happening. So you have potential for some actually quite interesting movements in there. Good parry. You see that in Talhofer, usually accompanied by a wrap because of the close distance. Kicking up the heels is referred to in quite a few treaties, quite often accompanied by a movement onto the jaw as well. So potentially within this fight scene, I'd say in those last two actions from the cover to the kick with the legs, the sweeping up of the heels, I'd say those are actually quite good actions. Usually you'd see more control of the opponent's weapon arm or their balance with the offhand as well. But
So what I've seen is I mostly know like a Italian style, specifically Fiore from the 1300s. But like he would what you do is you if the sword comes in and you kind of get to a lock, you grab the point of the sword and you bring it in tight to your hip, and that way you can just lay your opponent out. But their sword is tight against you, so yeah, you want to like grab that and bring it in. But yeah, if you can get their sword to be not a threat to you, any way you can do that is fine.
That part's actually reasonably good. So for that, I'm actually going to give it a 6 because I think those two aspects save it slightly.
Good job, Gladiator.
Okay, so again, we've got some very, very good bits on this. The first bit of this is the shunting away of the opponent. I really, really like this. He creates distance between the two opponents. Now, you could argue that maybe he'd want to push the opponents into each other, but he has a very, very good instinctive response. Push one away, get the weapon from it, and then onto the other one. And then a good, clean finish on one of the cuts. Nothing posh, just a simple cut of wrath in effect. Pretty good. I'd give that a 7.
job,
I think
Keanu.
that's quite a comfortable thing. Again, I think it's very easy within judging this from a human's perspective to get very focused on an individual. And this is showing good awareness of space, maintaining that distance, and then simple finishes, nothing posh.
That's fun. I've like never been good. I have not fought multiple people at once, so I can't speak for the spinning. But I do have a friend who's incredibly good at like the spinning moves. It's Bally something. I don't know. I don't remember exactly his style, but like he's incredibly good at the spinning and the multiple opponents thing. It's very impressive to watch.
So immediately the first attack is this big, I'll spin at you, I'll expose my back, and the distance is so bad that he could just be stabbed in the back.
Yeah. His measure is terrible. Like he's so close. You want to keep your sword point towards your opponent. Like basically at least you want to keep your sword in front of you. If there's only one opponent coming at you. Like because that way you can block their blade. You don't want to put your blade all the way behind you. And granted, again, I'm no more longsword stuff rather than rapier fencing. But I feel like but even in rapier fencing, it's always up front. You don't want to like go all the way back here. That's foolishness.
Yeah, it's a broadsword or a saber or something. Therefore, you have to go and cut candles or scenery. You don't use this like this. This is terrible.
That's a I thought it looked like a rapier. Oh no. No, it's not a rapier. It looked like one, like with the hilt, but that's short.
Quite often in Japanese swordsmanship, you're moving the glass deposits, the slag deposits, effectively silicon deposits that can be in steel. You're moving those throughout the entirety of the length of the blade, and through those foldings, you spread that out, so you make sure that your blade hasn't got one particular area of weakness. Now, with European swords, before we had that consistency, we did something very similar, except that we twisted them like string. So that if one thread was weak, then it could be a problem in itself, but you having multiple threads and twisting them around each other, you create something stronger. That said, swords do snap, swords do bend, and there's always a fine point, and you can't guarantee the process is not perfect. Even nowadays, with much more clear definitions of how steel should be made and produced, blades still break. So it's not impossible for this to happen.
Super bendy.
So this is where it really gets quite terrible. There's this insane idea that somehow longswords are really heavy, clumsy weapons. They are not. You can move a longsword much more quickly and much more dexterously than you can a rapier. It's still balanced as if to be used in one hand, but you have the advantage of being able to move it around the position of the forward hand. Now, even the most barbaric moment of a longsword, barbaric technique, we have a technique called the strike of wrath, which is a strike that uses the entirety of the anterior oblique sling. So it's the most powerful strike you can do. But it's not done foolishly. It's done as a mechanic. It's a way of claiming space in front of you, claiming that space for yourself, killing with it if you can, and then going on to pursue your opponent through that. Wide swings don't serve anybody, and they represent the actual piece of equipment very, very poorly. Doing a spin when you're not engaged with the opponent's blade is insane because you don't know what their sword is doing. And because you're so close and you don't know where their sword is, obviously they can cut you freely because they're still facing at you, they still have all of their requisite safety in their hands. 3, 4 out of 10.
Yeah, that was pretty... Even I could tell that that one was rough. And I thought they were rapiers at first, when they first started to move, because it looked like that is the stance that you would take. But... like this thing is like a proper like medieval style longsword, and it's like 3 pounds. It is not that heavy. You can do some serious quick movement with this thing. It's moving.
This, in case you didn't know, is the best fight scene ever in any film ever. The fencing in it is completely irrelevant. The fencing is part of a narrative device. It's not meant to overwhelm you. It's just there happening while the dialogue does.
I'm so glad that he's giving props to the princess bride. And it is, I agree, it is the best sword fight scene in any movie ever. I have, again, no real understanding on if this is a particularly well fenced. I don't know much about rapier fencing at all.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh?
I thought it fitting, considering the rocky terrain.
There's references to Bonetti's defense. I don't even really know what that is. But references to Tebow, and Tebow's one of my favorite systems. But they're not showing any awareness of Tebow. Tebow operates on the idea of the perfect angle that you see in a lot of Spanish swordsmanship, and destreza particularly, here where you have a 90-degree angle which is maintained as much as possible, and you don't make lateral movements with your arms, but all of this is what we call vulgar angles, where the point is higher than the hilt and lots of lateral movement.
Naturally, you must expect me to attack with Capaferro.
Naturally, but I find that Tybalt counts as our Capaferro.
Rapier, some people call it a side sword. The divisions are really a later thing. We don't worry about it too much. It's a sword that you hold in one hand. Now, again, we have the quillons. Quite often, which is like the crossguard in effect, quite often people would hold this simply like so, without their finger over the bars, and these extra rings would be to stop things from landing on your fingers when you're holding the sword normally, and this allows you to put your thumb on there. Later on, you start seeing people holding the sword like so, okay? But it's not universal. Sometimes it is just used like this. Okay. Sometimes these are very, very ornate, as you can see here. There's a lot of wire around here, and then sometimes it's just a simple cup.
There's something I want to tell you. Tell me. I'm not left-handed either.
The idea of being able to fence with both hands shouldn't be necessarily a problem. Fighting somebody who is differently handed to you as well shouldn't be an uncommon experience. So this kind of thing, although it's amusing, you don't want to do this sort of thing at close distance, because obviously while you're busy changing your sword hand, your opponent can stab you and this kind of thing. Here you have a bit where as the blade comes through, it disengages, so you're having the blade changing from one side to the other. And in order to fight that, what you're doing is, rather than doing lateral parries like this, you're wrapping the blade and you're staying engaged to it. And that can be used to throw the opponent's sword out their hand. So there's...
I've done that. I've done that. It was great. I was really pleased with myself. Just a little twist, and boom, his sword went out. I was like, yep, I win.
There's a degree of reality in that. It's good. Technically wise, I'd still give it sort of like a 6-7. Even with its parody fencing, it still has better fencing than a lot of the others.
Oh, and this is the one he said was really, really bad at the beginning. And again, I'm not recognized, like, a lot of the things that I've seen have been using a lot more like flat angle blades. And like you talking about Spanish fencing a lot. And again, my only knowledge really comes from like medieval Italian fencing, which is, it doesn't use like a side angles very often. That was more German, but like we use a lot more like just this, lots of this. This is a good angle, jaw to knee. That's like that's your angle you want to go for. So like I'm just like trying to see, it's like, but again for me, I'm just like, is it a bad job? Is it a bad fight? Or is it just a style I'm not used to? Because a lot of the time for me, it could go either way. So I'm glad that occasionally when I'm like, he's like, yes, this is bad.
That's quite nice because in effect you have a very, very nasty version of a movement of conclusion. And this is basically where, in using a sword to parry here, we then do something with the offhand. If we were doing Bartender, the idea would be to restrain the opponent's weapon hand so we can control it and we can choose whether they live or die, and we can show mercy at this point. If you're doing this, this is lovely. He doesn't have to worry about the guy's offhand so much because the guy has both hands on the sword. There's a closure off of the line, and the guy giving him the distance, because he doesn't have to move his feet, the guy's going to come and hit him anyway. He gets to push it aside, he gets to thrust through, he's got control of the opponent's sword still, and he gets to finish him. So that I actually quite like, that's pretty good. I'm not entirely sure holding your hand palm down with a longsword is a good way not to get the sword taken out. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. There is so much bad in this. Again, we're back on this idea that if you've got a longsword, you have to do this with it, and it has to be wide and spinny, and it has to be this big moves. It's meant to be dexterous. You have this idea that there's basically half an hour.
And again, like, that's a weird like, he's thrusting it like, the way that he's going forward with that sword is a really, it looks like an unwieldy way to make a thrust. Like, you can do a thrust from up high, but like that looked really uncomfortable.
Now, the idea of being this kind of space here, rather halfway between here and here, you don't want to be more than this way, far away from your opponent with the point at all times. So if they drive you away, you're trying to find a way to get your point onto them. Most longsword is intrinsically trying to dominate a space very, very close into the core of your opponent. If they move you sufficiently around, you're immediately back at another opening. If they stay tight on the blade and the angle's tight just enough to parry like so, you'll try and drive the blade in, still maintaining contact on that. All this wide around movement is complete nonsense. Okay, knocking the blade down and striking back up. Now, you could argue that this is almost a nodding in effect. The idea of beating someone's blade down and then hitting back up with the false edge.
We call it a rompre de punta. Go back up.
Here you see where the sword is sweeping wide and one person is standing with their point right in front of the other. You don't parry, then come back here. You stand here and you stab them immediately because the blade has moved out of presence.
Yep.
Well, that was good. Yep. If someone has got their back to you and you have a spear, do stab them in the back of the leg. That, again, redeeming feature. That's given another point.
My sword.
So I quite like the fight scene between Brienne of Tarth and Arya. I think that's quite good. It's cohesive. It has that real focus to it. So the movement is constant. Neither of them is really sacrificing. There's no great pauses. There's always, I want to be back in the fight. I want to be back in it.
It's hard to see what he's doing. I'm going to get my sword again. Hold on. It fell. We want it not to be falling down. I'll just put it on this side. There. That's okay. It can live over there, behind my. There. Now it's there.
Do like in general the hound fights because they are just like dead. That's good, and I think having that idea that a blade is intrinsically there to either stab someone or hit them with it and remove all the sort of like fussy detail is a very good thing to have in a series.
Unrelated. This whole series of movies, I wouldn't even call it a guilty pleasure. I don't feel guilty for liking them. They're not particularly technically well done. They're cheesy and ridiculous, and I adore them. Although that being said, the Scorpion King's the worst one. I mean, maybe. I haven't seen the third Mummy movie, or the one with Tom Cruise, but of the Mummy and the Mummy Returns, those are really good, and I don't hate the Scorpion King either.
First, the twirling is dreadful, but the blades are all over the place. There's no safety in them, and now we're being focused on a single opponent. We could use the sword in a much more efficient way. Even if I were to twirl the swords towards you, you'd always want one blade in presence, always one blade doing something, never having the swords over here. At that point, I think the idea of restraining the two weapon hands becomes more important than actually taking the weapons out of the hand. So at that point, I would suggest that potentially you're looking at a way of either throwing the opponent as far from you as possible, throwing them down the really big hole on the other side of you might be a good thing.
So multiple times for that one?
2.
There's Fiore has a term he calls dangerous walking, which boots, like the armored boots that a lot of people wore, were very pointy at the tip. So it's like you get their hands like this, you just pick up your foot and you stomp at whatever you can like kick at. Just stomp down. Dangerous walking.
Yep, she's dead now.
Yep.
Yeah, you're really looking at just absolute theatre here, and that's fine. It is what it is, but it's terrible, terrible sword fighting. This idea of driving people apart to fight. So you don't want to be standing still. You don't want people to be managing the space while your space is getting more and more cramped. One of the things that is misunderstood quite often is that in pattern welded blades, quite often these were given mirror polishes. And I believe, unless this is anecdotal, that there's reference to people blowing on the blades so that the breath actually brings out the pattern weld for a moment so you can see it. So yeah, blades historically are incredibly highly polished in various different places. Certainly in Japanese swords that's the thing, certainly in European swords it's a thing. Interesting tactical decisions here. So you have a point where somebody has control of a blade, and if you think like the parrying daggers, you have really options to take the blade of the opponent on your dagger or to take them on your sword and to attack them with the other. But in order to do so, you'd want to maintain that contact. So to do an action like this with the opponent's blade still directly in the middle doesn't make any sense.
She could just
really.
go down
So you
now.
had a point of control or a point of control. Both of those have been sacrificed. It's amazing that one of these people didn't die in the process of
Yeah, she should have just... Down you go.
this. There should have either been disemboweling or a stab or whichever, or the other person should have ploughed straight through the middle in the space. From the viewpoint of a good cohesive fight scene that involves realistic technique, I'm going to give that a 2.
All right, I did like this fight scene in this movie. I didn't like this movie very much, but I did like this fight scene. So let's see it get torn to shreds.
Okay, the first miracle of this fight is that they don't manage to kill each other. There are forms which consist about fighting around somebody. Usually that other person is disabled so that they're kind of in a position where you don't have to worry about them. They'll be prone or something like this, or perhaps you'll be bodyguarding someone, so it's a way of moving around each other. I would not really like to have my back to someone who is swinging something sharp or burny. So much of this is almost a method to show how he feels. So you have an expression of emotion going on in the fight scenes rather than necessarily being this very, very tight, cohesive fight. His anger is always explicit. Everything is these wide, powerful slashes that aren't necessarily good for defense. It's so heavily stylized. I think in things like the Revenge of the Sith, you have these very, very dynamic fight scenes between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and those, I think, are much more expressive at combat, even if the distance is a little bit funny, even if they're standing toe-to-toe and waving the swords around. There's a lot more aggression and interaction in that. As such, I think I'd give it a 5 out of 10, as in...
Okay.
It has aspects that I really enjoy. If I was going for my enjoyment of the fight scene, it would be an 8. I really, really love the Yoda fight scenes. I always have.
Think they're so silly.
It's that point where you separate any desire for reality. It doesn't have to be real. You know, if it's got dragons, if it's got the Force, it doesn't matter. It has to be something expressive of all the things you want in there.
I just didn't think that Yoda needed to have a fight with the lightsaber. I didn't think that was necessary. He didn't need to be a flips wizard. Oh, is this the bit where he cuts off her dress? Or was that the second one? Yeah, it's
Yes,
the one where he cuts
absolutely.
off her dress. Bam! I have still not actually seen this movie, but that was in the trailer, and it has lived in my brain rent-free ever since. I've never forgotten this moment.
Flesh you can cut fabric. It depends on different things like how sharp the sword is, but they are made to cut things. The horses were very realistic. Let's give it a 1.
It's not even that one wasn't perfect. Yeah, anyway. Anyway. Yes, that for sure. That scene took it away. That like was my childhood, that scene. I remember that trailer and I was like I was like, woo! Oh my god. Ah! Oh, that was fun. All right, I enjoyed that. And again, it's like I don't know much about any other kind of fencing other than the Italian like medieval style taught by specifically Fiore. Like that is the guy I know. I know one form. So it is fun to like watch as somebody who knows a whole bunch of different forms like break them down and like actually like I feel like I learned something. But also I feel like a lot of what I have learned translates fine. Like it translates pretty well. Like there's a couple of different types of cut that I would not have learned or that I don't know. There's a couple of different styles that use a very different form of combat, but I also feel like, you know, I could probably use a lot of what I have learned in most scenarios, honestly. So that's always fun. I feel like I could use it. So that was all fun for me. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to do more sword fight stuff. I really enjoy doing it. I enjoy learning about it. So if you want to see more stuff like this, go ahead and let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one.